Imagine the year is 1350. A trader has walked inland from the ocean for weeks, through dry forest, across rivers, known by different names, in every community he passes. Among the goods moving inland with him are glass beads made in India and fine cloth from the Persian Gulf world. Then the trees open, and he stops. A wall rises out of the hillside. Granite. Cut and fitted, stone by stone. Taller than 5 men standing on each other's shoulders. No mortar holds it together. Nothing needs to. It simply stands. Curved and silent. The way it has stood for generations before he was born. Behind that wall lives a ruler whose wealth is counted in cattle and gold, whose trade goods travel to markets across an entire ocean, and whose name survives in no known written record. Europeans will one day find these walls and refuse to believe that Africans built them. They will spend nearly 100 years inventing other explanations. Every one of them will be wrong. This is the true story of Great Zimbabwe, and it begins long before the first stone was laid. Chapter 1. The wall that needed no mortar. Start with the stone itself, because everything in this story rests on it. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe stand in the southeastern hills of the modern country of Zimbabwe, about 17 miles from the town of Masvingo, on a high plateau between 2 great rivers, the Zambesi to the north and the Limpopo to the south. The land here is granite country. Enormous rounded hills of grey rock rise out of the grassland, weathered smooth by millions of years of sun and rain, and scattered between them are boulders the size of houses that look as if they were dropped there by giants and then forgotten. To a farmer, this landscape offers grazing land and water. To a builder, it offers something else entirely. Granite, in this part of the world, does a remarkable thing. The rock heats in the fierce sun of the day and cools in the sharp chill of the night. And over thousands of years, that endless cycle of expansion and contraction causes the surface of the stone to split into natural layers. Sheets of rock that peel away from the parent boulder like the layers of an onion. Geologists call this process exfoliation. What the land offered these builders, in other words, was stone that nature had already begun to divide into workable slabs. Lying in the hills, in quantities beyond counting, the builders learned to harvest those layers and shape them into blocks. They may also have used controlled fire and water to help split resistant stone, a technique known from ancient quarrying and mining in many parts of the world. Although the exact methods used here are reconstructed by researchers rather than described in any surviving account, and from that stone, beginning somewhere in the 11 and 1200s, they raised one of the most extraordinary architectural complexes of the medieval world. The protected archaeological landscape at Great Zimbabwe extends across nearly 1,800 acres, although the dense, monumental core occupies only part of that area. Archaeologists divide the site into 3 main zones. The first is the hill complex, a maze of walls and enclosures built among the giant boulders on the summit of a steep granite hill, the oldest part of the site, occupied in some form for centuries before the great building began. The second is the valley complex, a scattering of smaller enclosures in the low ground beneath the hill, where much of the population lived. And the third is the structure that stops every visitor in their tracks, the one the trader in our opening saw rising out of the trees. It is called the Great Enclosure. Picture a wall of fitted granite blocks, curving in a great irregular ellipse more than 800 feet around. At its highest point, it stands about 36 feet tall, roughly the height of a 3-story building, and at its base, it is as much as 16 feet thick. Inside it stands a second wall, running parallel to the first and creating a narrow passage between them. A corridor of stone where 2 people can barely walk side by side, with the sky reduced to a bright ribbon far above. At the end of that passage stands a solid cone of stonework about 30 feet high, tapering gently as it rises, built with the same careful precision as everything around it. It is called the conical tower. It has no door, no stairway, no interior chamber. Investigations over the years have indicated that it is solid nearly all the way through. What it was for is a question we will return to later in this story, because the honest answer is that no one knows for certain, and the possibilities tell us as much about the people who built it as any answer could. Here is the detail that has astonished visitors for centuries. There is no mortar anywhere in these walls. No cement. No clay binding. No plaster holding the blocks in place. Every stone rests on the stones beneath it, held by nothing but weight, friction, and the skill of the hands that placed it. It would be easy to hear that and think of it as a limitation, as if these builders simply had not discovered mortar. That would be a serious misreading. And it is worth pausing on why. Building a stable, dry stone wall 36 feet high is far more difficult than building a mortared one. Mortar is forgiving. It fills gaps, corrects small errors, lets a careless builder get away with an uneven course of stone. A dry stone wall forgives nothing. Every block must sit true. The builders at Great Zimbabwe laid their courses in level, even rows, and tapered the great walls inward as they rose, keeping the mass stable and the center of gravity low. They favored long curves over sharp corners, avoiding the vulnerable angles where dry stone walls most often fail, and letting the forces in the masonry spread smoothly through the structure. Some sections even incorporate drainage openings, allowing the summer rains to pass through instead of pooling behind the wall and pushing against it. These are not the choices of people who lacked knowledge. These are the choices of people who understood exactly what their material could do and designed for it. And the proof of that judgment is simple. The walls are still standing. Roughly 700 years of rain, heat, tremor, tree roots, and human interference have passed over them, and the great curved walls remain, without a single repair crew from the civilization that raised them, though modern conservators now work carefully to keep them safe from the pressures of our own century. Along the top of the outer wall of the great enclosure runs one more detail worth carrying with you as you drift. A double line of stones set at alternating angles, forming a long zigzag band called a chevron pattern, running along a substantial stretch of the wall's upper course. It serves no structural purpose at all. It is decoration, pure and simple, placed at the crown of the greatest wall in the land. That pattern is a quiet message across the centuries. Whoever built this had moved far beyond shelter and defense. They had wealth enough to feed specialist masons for decades, order enough to organize labor on an enormous scale, and confidence enough to spend that labor on beauty. The name itself preserves a memory of what this place was. The word Zimbabwe comes from the Shona language, and though scholars discuss its exact derivation, the most widely accepted readings connect it to phrases meaning houses of stone, or venerated houses, the dwellings of rulers. The people of this region did not forget who built these walls. That forgetting, as we will see much later in our story, was done deliberately, by others, and it did not last. But before any wall could rise, something else had to exist first. Wealth, organization, a society with enough surplus to free hundreds of hands from farming and set them to cutting stone. Where did that wealth come from? To answer that, we need to leave the walls behind for a while and go back several centuries, to the wide grasslands of the plateau, and to the animal on which everything in this world was first built. Not gold, not ivory, cattle. Chapter 2. Before the stone, the cattle kingdoms. Every great building is an answer to a question that was asked long before the first stone was cut. So let us go back, several centuries before the walls, and watch the question take shape. The builders of Great Zimbabwe belong to communities ancestral to today's Shona-speaking peoples, part of the great family of Bantu languages spoken across the southern half of Africa. Their forebears had arrived on the plateau in a long, slow movement of farming peoples that unfolded over many centuries. A migration, not of armies, but of families, moving a valley at a time, bringing with them three things that would transform the land. They brought grain agriculture, chiefly sorghum and millet, crops that thrive in the summer rains of the plateau. They brought the knowledge of iron working, the ability to smelt ore into hoes and axes and spearheads, and they brought cattle. It is difficult to overstate what cattle meant in this world, and a modern listener should be careful not to picture a simple farmyard animal. On the Zimbabwean plateau, cattle were wealth itself, in the most literal sense. Consider what the plateau offered. The high country between the Zambezi and the Limpopo sits mostly above 3,000 feet. And that elevation matters enormously, because it affects the reach of the tsetse fly. The tsetse carries a disease deadly to cattle, and it thrives in the low, warm river valleys on either side of the plateau. The higher grassland in between was generally far less favourable to it, which made the plateau one of the finest cattle territories in the region. A broad expanse of good grazing between more dangerous lowlands. Whoever controlled that grass controlled the future. A herd of cattle is wealth that walks, wealth that grows by itself, wealth that can be moved when drought strikes, divided among sons, loaned to followers, and paid as the bride wealth that sealed marriages between families. A man with many cattle could lend animals to poorer neighbours, and those neighbours owed him loyalty in return. Herds bound society together in webs of obligation, and the men at the centre of the largest webs became chiefs. Archaeology lets us watch this happen. Across the plateau, excavations of early village sites have found the bones of cattle in steadily growing proportions, and many villages were arranged around a central cattle enclosure, placing the herd, quite literally, at the centre of life. At site after site, the pattern deepens over time, wealth on four legs, slowly reorganizing a society around itself. Then, in the centuries, around the year 1000, the pattern begins to change, and the change points south, to a river valley on the Limpopo. Two names matter here, and both come from the archaeology rather than from any written record, because this world wrote nothing down. The first is Leopard's Kopje, the name modern researchers gave to a culture of farming and herding communities, whose distinctive pottery spreads across the southwestern plateau from around the 10th century. These were prosperous people, working iron, tending large herds, and, crucially, beginning to dig gold. The second name is Mapungubwe. Mapungubwe was a hill settlement near the meeting point of the Limpopo and Shashe rivers, south and west of the future Great Zimbabwe. Its story unfolded in stages. For several generations, the centre of population and trade in that valley lay at a nearby settlement that archaeologists call K2. And then, in the early 1200s, the community moved to the foot and summit of Mapungubwe Hill itself. For most of that century, until its decline around the 1290s, Mapungubwe flourished as something the region had not seen on such a scale before, a concentrated centre of wealth and authority, holding perhaps a few thousand people, whose arrangement tells a story all by itself. The ruler and the elite lived on top of the hill. Everyone else lived below. The leader was physically separated from the people. raised above them, made distant and elevated in a way that later royal traditions of this region would echo for centuries. That separation was paid for by trade. Excavations at Mapungubwe have uncovered glass beads from the Indian Ocean world in large numbers, evidence that goods were moving between this river valley and the distant coast. And in the 1930s, in a grave on the hilltop, excavators found the object that has become the emblem of this entire early world. A small rhinoceros, covered in thin gold foil, buried with a person of clearly high status. The golden rhinoceros of Mapungubwe is today one of the most treasured artifacts in southern Africa, and it announces, with quiet confidence, a society that had gold, valued gold, and had mastered the working of it. Then, near the end of the 1200s, Mapungubwe faded. The reasons are still debated, and honesty requires saying so plainly. Many researchers point to climate, arguing from environmental evidence that a shift toward cooler and drier conditions made the Limpopo Valley harder to farm and graze. Others emphasize changes in the trade routes themselves. Perhaps it was both, braided together. What is clear is the broader shape of what happened next. As Mapungubwe declined, the strongest concentration of political and economic power in the region emerged farther north, on the high plateau, at Great Zimbabwe. Whether that shift involved movements of people or rival centers rising as an old one weakened, or some more complicated story, is beyond what the evidence can settle. What the evidence does show is continuity of culture. The same broad traditions of cattle wealth, elevated rulership, long-distance trade, and fine craftsmanship that had crystallized at Mapungubwe appear again at Great Zimbabwe, carried further and built higher. The rise of the stone city was not a miracle out of nowhere. It was an inheritance. The cattle wealth of the plateau, the social order of chiefs and followers, the elevated seat of the ruler, the long threads of trade reaching toward the ocean. All of it already existed in this world. Great Zimbabwe gathered those threads into one hand, and then did something with them that no one in the region had ever done on such a scale. To understand what, we have to follow two commodities, out of the ground and out of the bush. One of them glittered. The other was carried on the shoulders of the largest land animal on earth. Chapter 3. Gold in the rivers. Ivory in the bush. The gold was there long before anyone wanted it. The Zimbabwean plateau is one of the most gold-bearing landscapes in Africa. Ancient geological forces threaded the granite country with reefs of gold-bearing quartz. And over millions of years, rivers wore those reefs down and carried flecks of the metal into their gravels. The gold lay in the streambeds and in the stone, patient, indifferent, waiting for someone to decide it mattered. For a long time, it seems, few people did. For many early farming communities on the plateau, gold appears to have mattered less than iron, which made tools, and copper, which made ornament. Gold is too soft for a hoe and too scarce to be an everyday material. What changed its fate was not anything on the plateau at all. It was demand from across the ocean, from markets in Arabia and India where gold was money, and the slow discovery, moving inland, link by link, that the far interior of Africa held it in abundance. By the time Great Zimbabwe rose, gold had become the engine of the plateau's connection to the wider world, and it is worth being clear-eyed, as we settle deeper into this story, about what getting it actually involved. The simplest method was washing. In the winter, dry season, when the rivers fell, people worked the gravels of the stream beds, swirling sand and water in shallow wooden dishes, letting the lighter grains spill away while the heavy flecks of gold settled at the bottom. Slow, cold, patient work, and, quite possibly, the work of ordinary farming families in the quiet season. A way of turning empty months into wealth. The harder method was mining. And here, the evidence from the ground is remarkable. When European prospectors spread across this country in the late 1800s, they found the plateau already pierced with thousands of old workings. These so-called ancient workings were so common and so reliable as markers of gold that the newcomers used them as their principal guide to where the reefs lay. The old miners had already identified many of the richest reefs in the country. Those old workings tell us how it was done. Narrow shafts sank along the quartz reefs, following the gold down, some reaching considerable depths before water and air made deeper work impossible. Fire was set against the rock face to heat it, and water thrown against it to crack it. One of the oldest mining techniques in the world. The broken ore was hauled to the surface, crushed to powder between stones, and washed to free the metal. How that labor was organized, whether by family, by season, by obligation to a chief, or by some other arrangement, is honestly beyond what the evidence can tell us. What it can tell us is that the work was skilled, widespread, and sustained across centuries. As for how much gold all of this produced, the honest answer is that estimates vary widely and are difficult to verify. The old workings were dug before anyone recorded them, and their output can only be guessed at from the mines themselves. Some older accounts proposed very large totals for the region across the centuries before colonial rule. And while those figures should be treated as rough estimates rather than established fact, no one doubts the essential point. This plateau was one of the significant gold-producing regions of the medieval world. And when its gold reached the coast, it entered the same streams of commerce that fed Cairo, Mecca, and the ports of India, and gold was only half the cargo. The other half grazed and browsed in the lowlands, in herds that shook the ground. Elephants were plentiful in the river valleys below the plateau, and their tusks were, pound for pound, among the most valuable goods in the medieval Indian Ocean world. African elephant ivory is relatively soft and fine-grained, qualities that carvers prized. In India, it could be worked into ornaments, including the bangles worn at weddings, while workshops across the Indian Ocean world turned ivory into many kinds of luxury objects, from carved boxes to ceremonial pieces. The demand was broad, renewed with every generation, and it never slept. Hunting elephants with iron spears and pit traps was dangerous, specialized, prestigious work, and communities that mastered it gained a trade good that, unlike gold, required no digging at all. A single large tusk could weigh more than 100 pounds. A fortune. Walking through the bush. Now put the two together, and stand back far enough to see the shape of the system. Gold and ivory flowed from 1,000 streams and hunting grounds toward whoever could gather them. And gathering them is precisely what a ruler, rich in cattle, could do. Cattle wealth bought loyalty. Loyalty, organized labor, and tribute. Tribute, concentrated gold and ivory in the hands of the court, and the court exchanged them for the treasures of the ocean trade, which made the ruler more glorious still, which drew more followers, which brought more tribute. A wheel, turning, gathering speed with every rotation. Great Zimbabwe sat at the hub of that wheel. Its position was almost uncannily good, close to the goldfields, surrounded by fine grazing, and standing near the head of a natural corridor of rivers and valleys running down from the plateau toward the coast. And so, in the dry season, the porters set out, small, carefully wrapped quantities of gold, and heavy tusks lashed to carrying poles, moving east along paths worn by generations of feet. Behind them, the granite hills fall away and shrink into haze. Ahead, weeks of walking, and at the end of it, a smell none of them can mistake, even if they have never encountered it before. Somewhere, out beyond the last of the hills, the air begins to taste of salt. Chapter 4. The Road to the Sea. Follow the porters down from the plateau, and feel the world change around them as they walk. The high country falls away in long steps toward the east. The air grows warmer, then heavier. The open grassland gives way to thicker bush, and the nights lose their chill. The travellers keep to the dry season, roughly May through October, when the rivers are low enough to ford and the lowland fevers are at their weakest. And even so, the journey is measured in weeks. Somewhere past the last hills, the country flattens into a coastal plain, and then one day the wind carries the sea to them. The place they were walking toward was called Sofala, on the coast of what is now Mozambique, to the merchants of the ocean world. That name carried the same glow that the word El Dorado would later carry for Europeans. Arab geographers wrote of the land of Sofala as the country of gold, the far southern edge of the known world, the place where the metal came from. The 10th century writer al-Masudi, describing the East African coast, already spoke of the gold of this southern country. Generations before, Great Zimbabwe raised its first Great Wall. But there is a detail that makes this trading world remarkable, and it is a detail of wind. The commerce of the Indian Ocean ran on the monsoon. For half the year, the winds blow steadily from the northeast, carrying ships from Arabia, Persia, and India down the African coast. For the other half they reverse, blowing from the southwest, and carry the same ships home again. The monsoon was an engine, regular and free, and it had woven the shores of the Indian Ocean into a single trading world for centuries. A merchant could leave a Gulf port, ride one monsoon south, trade for months, and ride the other monsoon home. Yet the winds had a limit. The farther south a ship sailed along the African coast, the tighter the seasonal timing became, and Sofala lay close to the practical edge of the system. A ship that went that far south risked missing the wind home and losing a full year. The answer to that problem was not a better ship. It was a city. About halfway between Sofala and the heart of the ocean trade stood an island port called Kilwa. Off the coast of what is now Tanzania, Kilwa became one of the principal intermediaries of the southern seas, and in its greatest centuries, the dominant one. Many ocean-going ships from Arabia and India sailed as far as Kilwa and turned for home there, exchanging cloth, beads, and ceramics for the gold and ivory that coastal vessels had gathered from Sofala and the shore stations to the south. Kilwa took its share of every exchange and grew rich in the way that only a well-placed middleman can. How rich? The traveller Ibn Battuta, perhaps the most tireless voyager of the medieval world, visited Kilwa in 1331 and described it as one of the most beautiful and finely built towns he had seen. Its rulers minted their own coins. They raised the great mosque of Kilwa, with its domed and vaulted ceilings of coral stone, and a cliff-top palace called Husuni Kubwa, with more than 100 rooms and what appears to have been an ornamental bathing pool overlooking the ocean. Much of that prosperity was supported by Kilwa's role in the southern gold trade, alongside ivory and the many other kinds of commerce moving through the port. When you picture the domes of Kilwa, you are looking in part at the far end of a road that begins in the stream beds of the plateau, and this is where the true scale of the trading world becomes clear, because it changes the meaning of everything we have seen so far. Great Zimbabwe and Kilwa flourished in the same broad centuries. The archaeology and the chronicles agree on the overlap. The decades that saw the Great Walls climb on the plateau, saw Kilwa strike its coins and raise its palace by the sea. These were not two separate stories. They were parts of one vast commercial system, interior and coast, joined by chains of porters, river craft, and coastal ships stretching more than 1,000 miles, with many hands and many communities holding the links between. The people of the coast were the Swahili, African by descent and language, shaped by centuries of trade and by Islam, which had travelled down the coast with the merchants. Swahili is itself a Bantu language, related to the Shona spoken on the plateau, seasoned with words from Arabic. The old colonial idea that the coastal cities were foreign colonies planted by Arabs has been steadily dismantled by archaeology, which shows towns growing from African fishing villages into stone-built cities over many centuries. The coast was Africa facing the ocean, not the ocean occupying Africa. One more thing must be said, honestly. The trade of this coast was not only in gold and ivory. Enslaved people were also bought and sold in the ports of the Western Indian Ocean, as they were in most of the medieval world. And some were carried from this coast to Arabia and beyond. How far that trade reached inland toward the plateau in this period is genuinely unclear, and the evidence connecting it to Great Zimbabwe itself is thin. But a story that shows you the domes of Kilwa owes you the whole ledger, and that ledger has dark entries. Up on the plateau, no surviving evidence suggests that the rulers of Great Zimbabwe ever travelled to the ocean themselves. No account describes such a journey, and no coastal writer records receiving them. They knew the sea the way. You know, a distant relative who sends gifts, through the things that arrived on the backs of returning porters. So, picture those porters coming home, months later, climbing the last rise as the granite hills come back into view. Their loads are lighter now, and stranger. Bundles of cloth, sacks of small glass beads that shift and whisper with every step, and somewhere among them, carefully padded, a bowl glazed the pale green of shallow water, fired in a kiln so far away that no one on this road could name the country, let alone the town. That bowl has one more journey ahead of it, longer than all the rest. It will lie in the soil of this city for 600 years, waiting for someone to pick it up and understand what it means. Chapter 5. Persia, India, China. What the Shards tell us. Archaeology is the art of listening to small things. A ruler's glory fades. A name is forgotten. A wall can be explained away by anyone with a motive. But a broken dish in the ground is stubborn. It is what it is. Made where it was made. Dropped when it was dropped. And the soil of Great Zimbabwe, when it was finally examined with care, turned out to be full of small, stubborn things that all, independently, told the same story. Begin with the most distant of them. The green, glazed bowl we followed home in the last chapter. Excavations at Great Zimbabwe, from the early scientific digs onward, have recovered fragments of Chinese ceramics. Above all, celadon, the famous stoneware glazed in soft greens like deep water, produced by the kilns of China and exported across Asia in enormous quantities during the medieval centuries. Pieces of celadon lay in the ruins of a stone city in the heart of southern Africa. Later investigations of the wider region have added fragments of Chinese blue and white porcelain at related sites. No serious researcher suggests Chinese ships called at Sofala, a celadon bowl, reached the plateau the long way, passed from hand to hand through the great relay of the ocean trade. It may have moved through several of the ports and markets linking China, South Asia, the Persian Gulf, the Swahili coast, and the African interior, each pair of hands taking a profit, until by the end of its journey it had travelled, by whatever route, thousands of miles from the kiln that fired it. Think about what that bowl passed through. Languages it was never named in. Currencies it was priced in and then repriced. Storms, warehouses, riverbanks, a dozen sets of careful hands, and then a hilltop in Africa, where someone ate from it, or displayed it, or set it aside as too fine for use. Persia is in the soil too. The excavations recovered glazed wares of Islamic manufacture from the Persian Gulf world. The kind of pottery made in workshops of Persia and its neighbours and carried south as trade goods in the monsoon ships. Then there are the beads. And the beads are in some ways the best witnesses of all, because there are so many of them. Digs at Great Zimbabwe have yielded thousands upon thousands of small glass beads, in blues and greens and yellows and reds. Glass was not made in this region, and specialists who study the chemistry of ancient glass have traced the broad origins of such beads. Beads were the small change of the ocean trade. Cheap to ship in bulk, easy to divide, welcome everywhere. They filtered into every level of society, sewn onto clothing, strung on necks and wrists, and each one is a tiny sealed record of a journey across the sea. Metal from the coast has been reported too. Among the objects recorded from the site is a coin of Kilwa type, and if the identification and context hold, it is a satisfying piece of evidence, because it places the currency of the great middleman port in the capital of the gold country itself, the city of the intermediaries, present in metal, at the court of the suppliers, and the traffic ran both ways, which is a point too easily missed. Great Zimbabwe was not a passive receiver of wonders. Crucibles and other traces of gold working have been found at the site, along with copper ingots of standardized shapes, and iron tools and weapons in quantity. Objects such as double iron gongs, a form of prestige instrument known from Central Africa, have also been reported from the ruins, hinting at connections reaching not only east to the ocean, but north and west into the continent. The plateau sat inside a web, and threads ran out from it in every direction. Now step back and ask what this scatter of fragments actually proves, because this is where the small things become large, and where the logic deserves to be spelled out properly rather than left as a flourish. When archaeologists excavate a site, they read it in layers. Each period of occupation leaves its floor levels, its hearths, its broken pottery, its food remains, stacked one above another in the order time laid them down. If Great Zimbabwe had been built by some foreign colony, as later legend would insist, the layers would show it. There would be a horizon of foreign material culture, foreign house forms, foreign burial practices, a stratum where the newcomers lived, distinct from what came before and after. That is what such sites look like elsewhere in the world, and archaeologists know how to recognize it. That is not what the ground at Great Zimbabwe contains. What it contains, from bottom to top, is continuity. Local pottery traditions, developing generation by generation. Local house floors of daga. Local ironwork. Local spindle whorls. The bones of local cattle in enormous numbers, and scattered thinly through those local layers, like glitter on a deep fabric. The imports, the celadon and the glazed wares and the beads, sitting in the same floors, the same middens, the same households as everything else. There is no foreign stratum of the kind those old theories would require. Every major line of evidence points the same way, to local African builders. That conclusion would one day be delivered formally, by professional excavators, in reports that settled the question for science. But generations of Europeans would stand in these ruins first, look at this same evidence, and refuse to accept what it said. The celadon bowl, by then, had been in the ground for 500 years. It would wait a little longer. Chapter 6. A day inside the walls. The light comes first to the hilltop. Sometime around the year 1350, on an ordinary morning, the sun clears the eastern horizon and touches the highest walls of the hill complex before it reaches anything else in the valley. Smoke is already rising, not from one fire, but from hundreds. Thin grey threads climbing into the cool air from every quarter of the city, because a capital of this size wakes early. Before we walk its paths, one honest word about how we know what follows. No one wrote down a day in this city. What we have is archaeology, the layout of the ruins, the objects left in the soil, comparisons with later Shona society, recorded in oral tradition and by early outside observers, and the careful reasoning of researchers who have spent lifetimes on these questions. A day like this one is a reconstruction, built from those materials. Where the evidence is firm, I will say so. Where we are imagining our way between the firm points, I will let you hear it in the telling. With that understood, let the city wake. The first sound, beneath everything else, would have been cattle. Herds were folded for the night in enclosures, and at first light the boys and young men would move them out toward the grazing lands. We cannot count those herds from this distance, but everything about this society, from the bones in its middens to the place of cattle in later Shona life, tells us they were large and they were central. Picture the animals moving through the morning in slow rivers of hide and horn. The smell of them, dung and dust and warm hair, would have been simply the smell of home, the smell of wealth doing what wealth does, which is walk out to pasture and grow. Most of the city's people did not live inside stone walls at all. The great enclosures we have admired were for the few. The majority lived in houses of darga, a smoothed and hardened mixture of clay and gravel, built in circular form with thick walls and thatched roofs, cool in the heat and warm in the high-veiled winter nights. Excavation has shown that many darga houses were substantial, carefully made, their floors and walls polished, sometimes decorated. Stone marked its status. But clay was not poverty. Clay was the ordinary dignity of the city. Walk with the water carriers now, down the worn paths, and watch the city sort itself by task. Here, we can imagine a smelting furnace being fed, because this was an Iron Age capital, and iron never sleeps. Hose for the fields, axes, spearheads, wire. Elsewhere, specialists worked gold, and this is not imagination, because traces of exactly that fine work, hammered sheet and drawn wire and small crucibles, have been found in the ruins. Copper was worked too. Spinning went on in many households, for spindle whorls turn up across the site, evidence of thread being made, probably including cotton, which written sources from the wider region describe being woven in these interior lands. In the fields beyond the houses, which stretched farther than the eye could easily take in, the work of sorghum and millet followed the season. This, not gold, is what most hands in the kingdom did most days. Gold paid for glory. Grain kept everyone alive. It is one of the oldest arrangements in human history, and it was as true here as anywhere on earth. Now, lift your eyes to the hill, because everything in this landscape is arranged to make you do exactly that. The ruler lived above. The tradition of elevated, separated rulership that we saw crystallize at Mapungubwe appears here, carried to its height. The paths up the hill are narrow, in places passing between boulders in single file, so that no one approached the summit except slowly, and watched, based on later Shona royal practice. Researchers infer a court of officials and ritual specialists around the ruler, and a royal household, though the details of its organization at this early date are beyond certain knowledge. Cattle from the royal herds would have moved up as tribute and come back down as feasts and favors. The endless circulation of obligation that held the whole structure together. What did the people believe as this day passed over them? Here again we reconstruct carefully. Later, Shona religion, as recorded in recent centuries, centers on Mwari, the high god, distant and approached through intermediaries, and on the ancestors, the dead of each family who remain interested parties in the affairs of the living, honored and consulted. Many researchers hold that the roots of this religious world reach back to the time of the stone city, and certain features of the ruins, enclosures on the hill best explained as ritual spaces, suggest that the summit was as much sanctuary as palace. But we should say honestly that we are reading backward across centuries, and the beliefs of 1350 are inferred, not recorded. Which brings us, as evening comes down over the city, to the birds. Excavators recovered from the ruins a series of carved birds in soapstone, a soft, grey-green stone that takes fine detail. Each bird, roughly the size of an eagle, stood on top of a tall, carved column, and they appear to have been set up in the elite and ritual areas of the site. 8 are known. They are unlike anything found anywhere else. Birds with certain human-like features carved into them, raptor-like forms rendered with deliberate strangeness, and their meaning has been discussed for over a century. In later Shona belief, the eagle is associated with messages between the sky and the earth, between Mwari and the living, and many scholars read the birds as emblems of royal ancestors, the dead rulers watching over the city as messengers between worlds. That reading is thoughtful, and it may well be right. It is also, in the end, an interpretation, and the birds keep their own counsel. The fires burn down. The cattle are folded in. On the hilltop, perhaps, the carved birds stand black against the last of the light. A whole civilization is going to sleep around them, and the city has left us no writing of its own. Not a chronicle, not a king list, not a single inscribed name. Everything we know some other way. How do you remember a kingdom that never wrote itself down? And how do we? That question is the door into the next chapter. Let us walk through it. Chapter 7. The king nobody wrote down. Somewhere in the years around 1350, a person ruled from the top of that hill who was among the most powerful rulers in southern Africa. Cattle, gold, and tribute sustained that authority, and goods from this ruler's country entered markets across the Indian Ocean world. Porters walked weeks to bring tribute to the hill. We do not know this ruler's name. We do not know the name of a single ruler of Great Zimbabwe. Not one. In the entire history of the city. Consider how strange that is. From the same century, we know the names of kings of England and France in unbroken lists. We know the name of the Sultan of Kilwa from his coins. We know Mansa Musa of Mali, on the other side of Africa, because his pilgrimage to Mecca passed through the world of writing and left a wake of astonished chroniclers. Great Zimbabwe traded into that same literate world, and yet no traveller's account of visiting it survives. No chronicle records its rulers, and the city itself has left us no writing of its own, because the Shona world of that era, like most human societies in history, kept its records in memory rather than in ink. This chapter is about what that silence means, and what it does not mean, because the difference matters more for this story than for almost any other we could tell. Start with what the silence does not mean. It does not mean the society was simple. And it does not mean nothing was known or remembered. Societies without writing carry their law, their genealogy, their history, and their science in trained human memory, in praise poetry, in the formulas of ritual, in the knowledge of elders and specialists. Oral tradition is not the absence of record keeping. It is a different technology of record keeping, with real strengths. And its great challenge for historians is the way time reshapes detail. Names merge, chronology compress, and later concerns can alter the form in which older memories survive, because a tradition is kept alive by people who are also using it, to explain the present, to justify a claim, to hold a community together. Oral memory does not simply fade with distance. It is continually rebuilt by the living, which is both why it endures and why the particulars of a distant century are so hard to recover from it. And with Great Zimbabwe, history added a further difficulty. The city, as we will see, ceased to be the center of its world in the 1400s, and the focus of Shona power moved away. The communities that remained near the ruins preserved reverence for the place and traditions about it, but the direct line of royal memory was stretched thin by distance and centuries. Then came the colonial era, which actively assaulted the connection between the Shona and their monument, telling them for decades that their ancestors could not have built it. Silence was first natural, then imposed. So how, without names and chronicles, do we know anything at all? This is worth answering carefully, because everything in this story rests on the answer. We know from the ground. First, archaeology recovers sequence, the layers of occupation that show what came before what. It recovers scale, the size of middens and enclosures, and house floors from which population is estimated. It recovers connection, the celadon and the beads and the coin. It recovers craft and diet, and even, through the chemistry of bones and soils, environment and climate, radiocarbon dating, applied to the site from the mid-20th century onward, anchored the story in time, helping to place the site's principal monumental development within the later medieval centuries, roughly between the 1100s and the 1400s, with occupation reaching both earlier and later than the great building itself. We know from language and culture. Second, the continuity between the world of the ruins and the Shona-speaking society around them is written in the landscape itself, in hundreds of smaller, stone-built sites of the same tradition spread across the plateau, called Zimbabwe, and in the match between the layout of the ruins and the documented patterns of later Shona royal courts. When researchers in the 20th century asked what kind of society builds like this, the answer was standing all around them, in the living culture of the region. We know from the edges of the written world. Third, Arab geographers recorded the gold of Sofala. Portuguese writers in the 1500s, arriving on the coast, wrote down what African and Swahili informants told them about great stone buildings in the interior, and we will meet those accounts properly in a later chapter. These are outside voices, second-hand and sometimes garbled, but they are early, and they corroborate the picture from the ground. Watch what an honest historian does with these three streams, where they agree. Confidence is high. The trading system, the time frame, the African identity of the builders, all rest on multiple, independent lines of evidence, where only one stream speaks, or none. Confidence drops, and the honest words become phrases like, "the evidence suggests," or "we cannot know." You have heard those phrases throughout this story, and now you know exactly why. That is not weakness in the telling. That is the sound of history being done properly. There is one more thing the silence means. And it is the quietest and largest thing in this chapter. Everything this civilization wanted to say across the centuries. It's set in stone. If we allow the architecture to serve as metaphor, the walls are the chronicle. The chevron pattern at the crown of the great enclosure is the signature, and the birds on their columns are the portrait of a dynasty whose faces we will never see. A society that could organize that labor, sustain that vision across generations of building, and hold together a trading network reaching to the ocean, did not need our kind of writing to be fully, formidably itself. It needed memory, authority, and granite, and it had all three. The granite is still here. 2 of those 3 things went into the ground with the people who carried them. Chapter 8. The peak. How large was Great Zimbabwe? Every civilization has its high noon, a stretch of years when everything it has built works at full strength. For Great Zimbabwe, that noon falls in the 1300s. So let us stand in it for a while and ask the question that sounds simplest and turns out to be one of the liveliest debates in African archaeology. How big was this place? Really? For most of the last 100 years, the answer given in books and documentaries was a confident range. 10 to 18,000 people, sometimes even 20,000, living in and around the stone city at its height. That figure made Great Zimbabwe one of the largest settlements anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa in its era, comparable in population to well-known European cities of the same century. London in the 1300s is commonly estimated at a few tens of thousands. The Stone City, in this telling, played in that league. But here is where this story becomes a lesson in how history actually works. Because in recent years, that famous number has been challenged from within the field itself. A team of researchers, led by the Zimbabwean archaeologist Shadreck Chirikure, went back to the foundations of the estimate and asked an uncomfortable question. Where did 18,000 actually come from? What they found was that the figure had been proposed early, on limited evidence, and then repeated from author to author for decades, gathering authority through repetition rather than through proof. When the team modelled the population fresh, working from the extent of house remains, the likely lifespan of Daga structures, and the possibility that different parts of the site were occupied at different times rather than all at once, they concluded that the number of people present at any one moment may not have exceeded roughly 10,000 and could have been lower still. The difference is not a technical quibble. If areas once assumed to be occupied together were actually used in sequence, one neighborhood rising as another faded, then the city was not a single dense mass of humanity, but something that shifted and breathed across its landscape over the generations. The debate continues, as good debates do, and the honest summary is this. Older estimates placed the peak population between 10 and 18,000, with some accounts going higher. More recent modelling has challenged those figures and suggests the number present at any one time may not have exceeded about 10,000. Either way, by the standards of its region and era, this was a very large centre, but the exact size of its noon is still being measured, 7 centuries after the sun passed it. And size, in the end, may be the less interesting half of the question. The more interesting half is reach. A capital is only the centre of a thing, never the whole of it. Across modern Zimbabwe and into neighbouring countries, researchers have recorded hundreds of smaller walled sites built in the same tradition. The Mad Zimbabwe we met earlier. Some are modest, a single enclosure on a hill. Others are substantial courts in their own right. Their dating and their architectural detail tie many of them to the centuries of Great Zimbabwe's dominance. And the most natural reading, favoured by most researchers, is that a good number were the seats of subordinate chiefs and regional rulers. But how tightly did the center actually control that network? Here again, the older picture and the newer one differ in instructive ways. The older picture imagined something like a medieval kingdom on the European model. A capital commanding provinces. Tribute flowing inward on fixed obligations. The ruler's word running to the edges of the territory. Some researchers today argue for a looser and more layered arrangement, in which regional centers held real power of their own. Alliances mattered as much as commands, and the authority of the great city rested less on force than on prestige. Ritual, standing, wealth to distribute, and the sheer gravitational pull of being the place where the largest walls stood. In this reading, a regional chief followed the center, not mainly because he feared it, but because his own standing at home was built partly out of his connection to it. The finest goods, the deepest ritual authority, the most impressive architecture, all radiated from one place, and being inside that radiance was worth more than independence outside it. Which brings us to what the stone itself was for, and this may be the most important idea in this chapter. The great walls of Great Zimbabwe enclose spaces, but they are not fortifications in the sense a European castle would suggest. There are no battlements, no arrow slits, no towers built for war, and in many places the walls could be walked around rather than through. Most researchers, therefore, emphasize display, status, and the controlled management of access over conventional military defense. To build in fine, coarse stone was to declare rank. The higher and finer your walls, the greater your standing, and the greatest walls of all belonged to the center. In this reading, the great enclosure was not a castle. It was a proclamation, the visible form of authority itself. And every smaller Zimbabwe across the plateau that raised its own walls in the same style was writing the same sentence at a smaller size. I belong to this order. I hold rank within this world. Power, in other words, was built into the landscape where everyone could see it. And it worked on the mind long before it needed to work on the body. Set that wider world in its global frame for a moment. In these same decades, gold from the plateau's workings is flowing towards Sofala, and the southern trade is famous across the ocean world. Kilwa is at its own zenith, minting coins, hosting Ibn Battuta in 1331. On the far western side of the continent, in 1324, Mansa Musa of Mali makes his pilgrimage to Mecca and reportedly distributes gold so freely that accounts describe its value being affected in Egypt for years afterward. West African gold and Southern African gold were different streams feeding the same ocean of commerce, and together they made Africa, in this century, one of the great engines of the world economy. That broader picture is well supported, even though the scale and pathways of the trade remain subjects of continuing research. Somewhere on the Eastern Road, this year, like every year, the gold is walking to the sea, and, on a hilltop above the valley, in a household we cannot name, a green glazed bowl from the far side of Asia sits in the afternoon light. Still whole, still useful, still centuries away from being anything but an ordinary, beautiful thing that someone owns. Chapter 9. Why did power move away? Here is what the ground tells us. Stripped to its plainest form. Across the 1400s, the archaeological signal of Great Zimbabwe changes. Imported goods that can be dated, like styles of beads and ceramics, thin out and shift. Major stone building appears to cease. The layers of dense occupation give way to something much quieter. By the end of that century, the city had ceased to function as the dominant political center it had been for 200 years, and the focus of Shona power lay elsewhere. For a long time, this was told as a story of abandonment. A civilization walks away from its capital. The grass grows in the enclosures. The end. You will still find it told that way in older books. But the evidence, read carefully, supports something less absolute and more interesting. There is no destruction layer at Great Zimbabwe. No ash and arrowheads. No sign of sack or catastrophe. And the site was not simply emptied and forgotten. Research indicates that occupation continued in some form after the political decline, thinner than before, and that the place retained ritual and spiritual importance in the centuries that followed. A revered site, a place of ancestors. Even as the political noise moved away, what ended in the 1400s was not the city's existence. It was the city's centrality. So the better question is not, why did they leave? It is, why did power move away? And that question has occupied researchers for a century. Because the honest answer is that several forces were pressing on the stone city at once. And weighing them against each other is genuinely difficult. Consider the oldest explanation first. The one you will meet most often. A large centre, sustained for 2 centuries, presses hard on its surroundings. Firewood for thousands of hearths and for the furnaces of iron working must come from somewhere. And as decades pass, wood must be carried from farther and farther away. Fields crop the same soils season after season. Cattle in large numbers eat grass. And grazing land under heavy pressure degrades. In this reading, the city slowly exhausted its own neighbourhood until the sensible choice was to move. And institutions from UNESCO downward have long presented some version of this environmental account. It is a plausible mechanism, and some of that pressure was surely real. But remember the population debate from our last chapter, because it reaches directly into this one. The environmental exhaustion model was built in part on the old picture of 18,000 people packed together, straining the land to its limits. If more recent modelling is right, and the population at any one time was lower and more spread out, then the strain was smaller than the old story assumed. Recent scholarship has weakened the picture of an overcrowded city devouring its surroundings. Environmental pressure may have been real without being decisive. It is a caution worth carrying through everything that follows. When one famous number falls, the theories that stood on it must be reweighed. Climate is a second force. And here, the evidence comes from outside archaeology altogether. Some environmental records for southern Africa, drawing on sources such as tree rings and lake sediments, indicate phases of cooler or drier conditions during the wider period, often associated with the Little Ice Age. Although the local timing of those phases and their effects on the plateau remain debated, on the plateau, rainfall is life. Drier decades would stress the grain harvest and the pasture together, and a political order whose authority rested partly on distributing plenty would feel that stress in its bones. You may remember that a shift toward harsher conditions is one of the leading explanations offered for the decline of Mapungubwe 2 centuries earlier. Some researchers see a rhyme here. The same slow force moving the center of power a second time. The third force has teeth, and it is trade. Great Zimbabwe's wealth depended on its position in the flow of gold towards Sofala. But, in the 1400s, the geography of that flow was changing. To the north, along the Zambezi River, an alternative corridor to the coast was gaining importance, and new powers were rising to command it. Gold from northern goldfields could reach the ocean without ever passing through the southern plateau's networks. If the river road north was capturing a growing share of the traffic, then the old centre was slowly being cut out of its own business, not by any enemy, but by geography quietly rearranging itself. And the fourth voice belongs to the Shona themselves, and we should listen to it with the particular care owed to tradition. Shona, oral tradition, written down centuries later and echoed in early Portuguese accounts from the coast, tell of a ruler remembered as Nyat Simba Mutota, who in the mid-1400s led his people north from the old heartland toward the Zambezi Valley. In the most commonly repeated version, the move was prompted by a shortage, often, specifically, a shortage of salt, though many historians read the salt as standing for resources and opportunity generally. Mutota and his successors established a new power in the north, a state remembered as Mutapa, whose ruler carried the title Mwene Mutapa. The traditions differ in detail and chronology. A tradition do, and they describe the movement of a court and a following rather than the emptying of a country. But they preserve a broad pattern compatible with the political shift visible in the archaeology, a deliberate relocation of the political centre, led from the top, away from the old capital and toward the roots that now mattered. Set the four forces side by side now, and resist the urge to crown a single winner. Land under some pressure, rains growing less reliable, the gold road drifting north, and a court capable of reading all of it and acting the way this world had acted when Mapungubwe faded. Not a collapse, not a flight, something closer to a strategic relocation by a political order that had always known how to move, leaving behind a place too sacred to abandon entirely and too far from the new arteries of wealth to remain the capital. A combined explanation of this kind is attractive to many researchers, although the balance among these forces remains contested, and a definitive answer may simply not be recoverable at this distance. The walls, of course, did not care. Built without mortar, they needed no maintenance crew, no court, no king. They went on standing through the rise of Mutapa, through centuries of quiet, the grass growing taller in the enclosures, the birds on their columns watching over a smaller and smaller town, far to the northeast. Meanwhile, the new kingdom prospered, and word of its gold began, as word of gold always does, to travel down the rivers, along the coast, into the ports. And in the first years of the 1500s, that word reached men who had just arrived in the Indian Ocean in ships unlike any seen there before, carrying cannon, charts, and a book of scripture whose legends they took with them everywhere. Chapter 10. The Portuguese Rumour and the Myth of Ophir. In November of 1497, 4 small ships rounded the southern tip of Africa, and by the early months of 1498 they were sailing north into the Indian Ocean. Their commander was Vasco da Gama, and he was looking for a sea road from Portugal to the spices of India. What he found, to his considerable surprise, was a coast already rich, already connected, already trading. The Swahili world, we visited earlier in this story, going about business it had conducted for centuries without any need of Europe. The Portuguese asked, in every port, the question they asked everywhere on earth: where does the gold come from? The answer came back, again and again, from Sofala, from the country behind Sofala, from a kingdom in the interior, ruled by a great lord, where there were buildings of stone. The Portuguese moved with the speed of hunger. In 1505, they seized Sofala itself, planting a fort at the door of the gold trade, and in the decades that followed, their agents pushed up the rivers, gathering information about the inland power they called the Kingdom of Monomotapa, their rendering of the royal title Mwene Mutapa. This, remember, was the northern successor state, the kingdom whose founding traditions we met in the last chapter. The Portuguese were dealing with the heirs of Great Zimbabwe, generations after the old capital had ceased to be the centre. But word of the old capital reached them anyway. In 1531, a Portuguese officer at Sofala, named Vicente Pegado, recorded a description, gathered from African informants, of a fortress in the interior, built of stones of marvellous size, with no mortar joining them. And, in 1552, the historian João de Barros, compiling accounts of the Portuguese enterprise in the East, described the same place more fully. An ancient building of dry stone in the gold country, known by a name he rendered as Zimbabwe, associated with the kings of the land. He added a detail worth hearing with care. He reported that the local people, when asked who had built it, said it was not the work of men at all, that it must be the work of the devil, because such construction seemed beyond human power. Whether his informants truly said anything of the kind, or said something subtler about ancestors and deep antiquity that lost its shape as it passed through interpreters and across languages, we cannot know. What we have is what a Portuguese writer, at second or third hand, understood them to mean. Pause on what has just happened, because it is the hinge of the entire second half of our story. Great Zimbabwe has entered the written record of the outside world, and in the same breath, that record has already begun to look beyond the people living in the region for an explanation. Why? What made the doubt so easy? The answer lies not in Africa at all, but in a book the Portuguese carried with them everywhere. The Bible tells of King Solomon, wealthiest of the kings of Israel, whose ships sailed every 3 years to a land called Ophir and returned with gold, along with ivory and other treasures. It tells too of the Queen of Sheba, who came to visit Solomon in splendor, where Ophir actually lay. If it lay anywhere, Scripture never says, and for centuries, mapmakers and scholars moved it around the edges of the known world like a lost coin. Arabia, India, the islands of the East. Now, put yourself inside the mind of a Portuguese official at Sofala in the 1530s. You are standing at the outlet of a gold trade of visibly ancient roots. Behind you, inland, is a mysterious stone city of unknown age. In your cabin is a book describing a distant golden land that ships once visited. The conclusion assembled itself almost without effort. Ophir was here. The gold of Solomon had come from these rivers. The stone buildings were the work of Solomon's agents, or the Queen of Sheba's people, or some other visitor from the biblical world. Writers of the era, de Barros among them, connected the gold of this coast with the Ophir tradition, and the idea spread through European writing about Southeast Africa and settled in deep. Understand clearly what the idea required. It required that the stone city be foreign. If Solomon's fleets or Sheba's builders raised those walls, then Africans had not, and the entire inland civilization became, in European eyes, the ruin of someone else's outpost, an intrusion from the biblical East into a continent imagined as having no history of its own. It is worth being precise here, because precision is the whole moral of this story. The Portuguese writers of the 1500s were not conducting a campaign of deliberate deception. They were fitting a rumour to the map of the world they already carried in their heads. And the map was made of scripture and legend. The result was error, not yet malice. The malice would come later, when the error became useful. For the next 3 centuries, the legend slept. The Portuguese never established control over the plateau interior. The Mutapa state and its neighbours held their country. The gold trade waxed and waned. Empires rose and fell in Europe, and the old walls stood in the grass, held in reverence by the communities around them, unseen by any European eye that left a record. Then, in the 1800s, Europe came back to Africa with new appetites, new rifles, and the old legend still folded in its baggage. In 1871, a lone German geologist walked north from the Limpopo, following rumors of ruins, with the story of Ophir already alive in his mind before he ever saw a single stone. His name was Karl Mauch. What he found, what he decided it meant, and what was done with that decision for the next 100 years, is the strangest chapter in this entire history. It is the story of how a civilization was stolen on paper, and how patient science stole it back. Chapter 11. The Century of Denial. Karl Mauch was 34 years old, nearly penniless, and possessed by Africa, a school teacher's training, a geologist's eye, and an explorer's hunger had carried him from Germany to the southern African interior, where, through the 1860s, he tramped enormous distances on foot, mapping, collecting, and listening. And the rumor he kept hearing, from hunters and traders, was of great stone ruins in the country north of the Limpopo. In September of 1871, guided at the last stage by a hunter named Adam Render, who lived in the region, Mauch walked up a granite valley and saw, rising out of the trees, exactly what the trader in our opening saw 5 centuries before him. The towering curve of the great enclosure. Mauch's journal records genuine awe, and he deserves to be remembered as the man who brought the ruins to the world's attention. But watch what his mind did with the evidence, because it did the same thing the Portuguese minds had done, only in greater detail. He examined the walls and concluded that such workmanship could not, in his judgment, be the work of Africans. He convinced himself instead that he was standing among buildings connected to the Queen of Sheba and the World of Solomon. He went so far as to test a sliver of wood from a lintel at the site, decided from its scent and character that it was cedar, and reasoned that cedar of Lebanon proved the biblical connection. Later examination indicated the wood was a local African species. The reasoning was worthless. It did not matter. Mauch's reports reached Europe. The newspapers took up the story, and the ancient legend of Ophir now had a specific, spectacular street address. And here, the story acquires a paymaster. In the 1880s and 90s, the British businessman Cecil Rhodes was assembling, through his British South Africa Company, the conquest of the very territory in which the ruins stood. The country would soon carry his name, Rhodesia, and for Rhodes and the settler society he planted, the Ophir legend was not idle romance. It was useful. If the ruins were the work of ancient foreigners, then white settlers were not intruders in this land. They were, in the story they told themselves, civilization returning to a country it had visited once before. The ruins became a founding myth. Rhodes took a keen personal interest, acquired artifacts from the site, and sponsored investigation, openly intended to connect the ruins with the ancient world of the North. The investigation he sponsored came in 1891, in the person of J. Theodore Bent, an English antiquarian. Bent dug at the site, and although much of what he actually found was frustratingly local in character, his published conclusions pointed away from Africa, toward ancient builders from the direction of Arabia. Worse followed. In the early 1900s, a journalist named Richard Nicklin Hall was given charge of the site, and his clearances were so destructive that archaeologists have mourned them ever since. Convinced that the African occupation layers were mere later debris lying over the true ancient city, Hall stripped away enormous quantities of exactly the deposits that held the site's history, seeking a foreign foundation beneath. He found none. None existed, and in the searching, evidence was destroyed that can never be recovered. Alongside the digging, treasure hunters had already ransacked ruins across the country in the 1890s, operating with the blessing of the company era, melting down ancient gold work by the ounce. The damage of those decades is a permanent wound in the historical record. But real science was coming, and it arrived in 2 campaigns, both commissioned by a learned institution troubled by the controversy. In 1905, the British Association for the Advancement of Science sent a young archaeologist named David Randall-MacIver, trained in the rigorous excavation methods, then transforming the field, to examine the ruins with fresh eyes. He dug, he recorded, and he reported without flinching. The material culture of the site was African in character through and through, and the datable imported objects in its layers, the very Chinese and Islamic wares we met earlier in this story, placed the site not in remote biblical antiquity, but in the medieval centuries. There was nothing of Phoenicia, nothing of Arabia, nothing of Solomon. The settler public was outraged. The argument raged on for another generation. So, in 1929, the British Association tried again. And this time, it sent one of the most formidable field archaeologists of the age, a woman named Gertrude Caton-Thompson. She brought a trained team, cut careful stratigraphic excavations in undisturbed ground, and even engaged an airplane to survey for deposits that Hall's destruction had spared. Her conclusion was delivered without ambiguity. The ruins were African, built in the medieval period by the ancestors of the local Bantu-speaking peoples, and she described them as the product of an indigenous civilization of genuine originality and achievement. Her work was the decisive turning point, though it is worth saying honestly that a scientific consensus is built rather than declared. In the decades that followed, excavation after excavation, and above all, the arrival of radiocarbon dating at mid-century, confirmed and refined her verdict. Until within professional archaeology, the question was closed. It has never seriously reopened. You might expect the story to end there. It does not. The final act is in some ways the hardest to believe, because it is the most modern through the 1960s and 70s. The white minority government of Rhodesia under Ian Smith was fighting to preserve settler rule against African nationalism. A monument demonstrating sophisticated African statecraft stood in the middle of the country, and the African liberation movements had embraced it, taking its name and its symbols for their own. The truth about Great Zimbabwe had become, for that government, politically intolerable, because it challenged the historical claims through which minority rule justified itself. The claim that Africans had built nothing here, and that history in this land began with Europeans. So the state leaned on the past. Accounts from archaeologists who worked in Rhodesia in that era describe official pressure over how the site's origins were presented to the public, with guidebooks and displays, keeping long discredited foreign origin theories alive as respectable possibilities. Decades after science had discarded them, professionals protested. Some paid for it in their careers. This was no longer the innocent era of the Portuguese, nor even the motivated romance of Mauch. This was a modern state curating the past, holding open a question that evidence had closed. Because the answer was politically unwelcome, hold the full arc of it in your mind. Because you have just watched an idea travel 400 years, a rumor misread through scripture in the 1500s, a legend embraced by an explorer in 1871, a myth funded by an empire builder in the 1890s, a truth established by science in 1905 and driven home in 1929, and a denial maintained by a government into the 1970s. Defended last and hardest exactly when the evidence against it was strongest. The stones never changed. Only the willingness to see them did. And then, in 1980, the country changed hands, and the new nation reached for its deepest symbol. It did not have to search long. Chapter 12. The Bird on the Flag. In the first minutes of the 18th of April, 1980, in a stadium in the capital city, then called Salisbury, one flag came down and another went up. The country of Rhodesia, named for the man who had claimed it with a company and a legend, ceased to exist. The new nation that rose in its place needed a name, and its people had already chosen one. Carried through years of struggle and exile and war, they named the country Zimbabwe. Consider what that means. Countries are usually named for rivers, for peoples, for old kingdoms, for the compass points of colonial map-making. This country named itself for the houses of stone, and above all, for the great ruined city that had carried the name through the centuries. The monument that a settler state had spent decades explaining away became the name on the passports, the name at the United Nations. The word the whole world would now use for that land between the rivers. The ruins were no longer a question mark in the grass. They were the birth certificate of a nation. And on the new flag, there appeared a bird. You have met this bird before, standing in soapstone on its column above the sleeping city. The carved birds of Great Zimbabwe became the national emblem, and the silhouette of the Zimbabwe bird now flies on the flag and marks the coins and the official seals. A medieval royal carving serving as the badge of a modern state. Few national symbols anywhere on earth carry so much compressed history. A bird carved by an unknown artist around 7 centuries ago, in a city whose rulers' names are lost, looted and disputed and reclaimed. Now watching from every flagpole in the country, the birds themselves lived a story worthy of the walls they came from. In the plunder years of the late 1800s, carved birds were removed from the site. One was acquired by Cecil Rhodes and kept at his house in Cape Town, where it has remained under the arrangements by which he left the property. Others passed into collections abroad, and through the 20th century and into the 21st, most found their way home, piece by piece. In one case, the homecoming was a literal reassembly, the lower fragment of one bird, which had ended up in a museum collection in Berlin. He was returned in 2003 and rejoined to its upper half after more than a century of separation. The reunited carving now stands with its fellows in Zimbabwe, most of them kept at the site museum within sight of the hill where they once presided. The ruins themselves are today a national monument and a place the world has formally recognized. In 1986, Great Zimbabwe was inscribed on the World Heritage List maintained under UNESCO, the United Nations Cultural Organization, in recognition of its outstanding value to all humanity. Visitors walk the same narrow passage between the great walls that we walked at the beginning of this story, and stand before the conical tower, and climb the hill by the old constricted paths. Conservation is a constant, careful labor, for dry stone walls, ironically, are threatened most by the feet and hands of the visitors who love them, and sections have needed gentle stabilization over the years. The communities around the site maintain their long relationship with it. For many, it remains a place of spiritual weight, not only a monument, but a shrine. Scholarship, meanwhile, has entered its richest era. Zimbabwean archaeologists now lead the study of their own past, and you have already met the results in this story. Because the population research that reopened the question of the city's size came from exactly this generation. New questions are being asked that the colonial era never thought to ask. About ordinary households, about the lives of women, about water management and farming and craft, about the wider landscape of settlements beyond the famous walls. Techniques undreamed of by earlier excavators keep drawing new information out of old ground. The story you have listened to tonight is not a closed book. It is a book still being written, and some of its most interesting pages may still be ahead. And what of the old idea? The long insistence that someone else must have built it. Among those who study the evidence, there has been no controversy for the better part of a century. It survives only where defeated myths always survive. At the margins, repeated now and then by the careless or the motivated, and the ground answers it the same way every time. The trader from our opening, if he could stand today where he stood in 1350, would find the wall he saw still standing, still curved, still silent, still holding itself up by skill and weight alone. Nothing about it has changed. Everything about the way the world sees it has. Chapter 13. Epilogue. What stone remembers? It is night on the plateau now. The visitors are gone. The gates are closed. The granite hills give back the heat of the day slowly, the way they have every night for longer than human beings have existed. And the ruins settle into the dark. This is the hour that belongs to the long view. So let us take it, quietly, as the story lets us go. 700 years is a long time for anything made by hands to stand. Nearly everything else from that world is gone. The thatch went first, in a season. The Daga houses softened back into the earth within lifetimes. The cattle, the cloth, the voices, the names of the rulers. All of it has gone wherever the ordinary substance of a civilization goes. What remains is what was hardest and what was truest. Granite, fitted with such judgment that it needed nothing but itself. And one more thing remains, smaller and stranger. Somewhere in a museum case, cleaned and labelled, lies a fragment of green, glazed pottery. It was made in China, sold in a port whose name it never learned, carried by ship and river and human back across thousands of miles, owned by someone on a hilltop in Africa whose name is lost, broken at some ordinary moment nobody recorded, and left in the ground for 600 years. When the arguments raged about who built these walls, that fragment lay in the soil, silent and correct. It had been in an African house all along, on an African floor, among African pottery, exactly where the evidence said it should be. It never spoke a word in its own defense. It simply waited to be read. We spent this night walking through centuries, a herding family measuring wealth in horns at dusk, a ruler on a hilltop above the Limpopo, visibly separated from the people below, miners reading the quartz by firelight, porters smelling salt after weeks of walking, a bowl wrapped for the long road inland, a carved bird raised on its column against the evening sky, a court moving north toward new rivers, and grass growing taller in the quiet enclosures, a geologist convincing himself of Cedar and Solomon, a woman with a trowel and an airplane, finding the truth in the layers, a flag rising in the first minutes of an April morning with a stone bird on it. None of these people knew they were in a story together. That is the gentlest secret history keeps. The herder could not imagine the flag. The archaeologist could not hear the dusk lowing of the herds. Only from here, from the quiet end of the telling, does the whole thread show at once. And if the thread has a lesson, it is a soft one, worth carrying into sleep. Evidence is patient. It does not argue. It does not raise its voice against the confident and the powerful. It simply waits in the ground, in the beads and the shards and the courses of stone, until someone comes willing to look at what is actually there. For 4 centuries, the walls of Great Zimbabwe were explained through stories that denied or obscured the people who built them. The walls answered with nothing but standing. In the end, standing was enough. Somewhere in the dark, the wall, the trader saw, still curves along the valley floor. The chevron pattern at its crown is invisible now, waiting for morning, when the first light will find the hilltop before it finds anything else, the way it has since the city was alive. The rulers are nameless. The builders are nameless. The city outlived every name it ever held, and then gave its name to a nation. The stones do not remember any of it. Of course, stones remember nothing. We do that part. That is what this night was for. Sleep well.